Our story begins with a man who gained the power of a creator, only to be diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer the very next day. To save his life, he transformed his family's old orchard into a massive sandbox world where he attempted to accelerate the evolution of life. His only hope was to create a civilization capable of curing cancer itself. As the tiny inhabitants of this square sandbox explored their world, they were suddenly struck by a terrifying realization. Their world was flat, and there were giants standing tens of thousands of feet tall. Whenever a civilization's development failed to meet his expectations, he would simply tear everything down and start over. He gave the heroes of each civilization a single chance to ask him a question. When they asked how long it took to create the world, he recalled the days he spent hauling soil to build the sandbox. It had taken him exactly 7 days to prepare this land. And so, the legend that God created all things in just 7 days began to spread across the world. Civilization after civilization rose and fell within his sandbox. But who could have imagined that so many brilliant cultures actually originated from a single spore? To be honest, it all started quite simply. He built an artificial shallow pond in the white soil sandbox of the orchard, carefully adjusting the salt levels to mimic a vast ocean. Into this central sea, he released a massive amount of zerg spores and accelerated their cell division by 10,000 times. For every day that passed in reality, 10,000 years drifted by in the sandbox. Yet, even at this speed, it took until the 5th day for these single-celled organisms to finally evolve into various forms of plankton. As the central ocean grew visibly murky, he quickly set genetic constraints to limit the size of these spore-based creatures, ensuring they wouldn't evolve into something too massive. By the afternoon of the 6th day, after 5 days of a single-celled Paleozoic ocean, multicellular life finally appeared in the water. In just a few minutes, like an accelerated nature documentary, new species were born and went extinct within seconds, only to give rise to the next generation. But as the sun began to set, things took a predictable turn. The sandbox world faced its first mass extinction. 12 hours of darkness meant this world would be without sunlight for 5,000 long years. Vast stretches of aquatic plants withered and sank to the seabed, leaving the dark waters devoid of life. His sandbox environment was small, and the sparse biological foundation wasn't enough to evolve new species that could adapt. However, his ocean contained the incredibly resilient Zerg single cells. Half an hour after the moonlight hit the water, a faint blue glow emerged on the surface amidst the plant remains. It was the beginning of something new. And so, we see the first true survivor emerge, a tiny, resilient species of aquatic plant. This blue-silver grass, as he called it, successfully endured the first mass extinction and began to evolve rapidly within seconds. It adapted frantically to the darkness, spreading across the surface like lily pads to absorb the moonlight from the orchard sky. An hour later, after tens of thousands of generations of evolution, it began to branch out into 2 distinct and specialized species. One group of blue-silver grass focused on maximizing moonlight absorption, while the other took a surprising turn toward becoming carnivorous. These predators used a faint, bioluminescent glow to lure their prey in the dark waters. Observing this, he quickly grabbed a black notebook and opened the first page of his Genesis to record the era of the dark dance. He wrote, "The heavens changed, the sun set, and the world fell into 5,000 years of darkness. 99% of marine life perished, leaving only the blue-silver grass to survive and become the absolute ruler of this dark, oceanic era." He watched the pond, now a sea of life, eagerly waiting to see what kind of marine animals would evolve from his resilient cells. He stayed awake all night until dawn, but when the 7th day finally began, a new disaster struck. The various types of blue-silver grass that had flourished in the dark began to wither instantly, scorched by the sun they weren't prepared for. In an instant, a second mass extinction began. By the afternoon, however, a hint of blue emerged from the dead colonies. It was a star-shaped variant of the grass that had mutated just in time to escape this latest extinction event. To adapt to the intense sunlight, it bred through countless generations in just a few minutes, rising from the ashes of its ancestors. The blue hue gradually faded, replaced by a deep black-blue, star-shaped seagrass. Deeply moved, he decided to name this new species the purple shroud grass. He turned to the second page of his notebook and titled this new chapter the Festival of Light Dance. He recorded how the 5,000 years of scorching sun wiped out the former rulers, while a weaker lineage of purple shroud grass rose to become the dominant protagonist of this new era. As the night of the 7th day arrived, the purple shroud grass lived on peacefully, having conquered the extremes of its small, square world. His single-celled organisms began to evolve, and the first to emerge were a group of black-jawed, worm-like creatures. At last, marine animals had stepped onto the historical stage of the evolutionary era. Seeing these animals appear, he finally allowed himself a gratified smile. After enduring the exhaustion of staying up all day and night, he returned to his room and collapsed into sleep. When he woke, it was the 8th day of his sandbox creation. he discovered that some marine creatures, unsatisfied with the fierce competition of the sea, had evolved into amphibians to live on the barren shores. Quickly, he turned to the page after the Festival of Light Dance to record the third era, the Cenozoic era. Through clever advantages, they defeated their rivals to become the overlords of this new period. He wrote that those crawling from the sea would rule for a long age. He quietly closed the black notebook. Although his little buns were about to evolve into land creatures, he wondered how long it would take before intelligent life finally appeared. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration. He would drop his own blood into the mix. It was a bold idea, perhaps too bold. Being cautious, he decided to experiment with other genes first. He headed to the zoo and, using a university project as an excuse, purchased a chimpanzee blood sample. By the time he returned to the orchard, the entire white mold sandbox had transformed into a miniature ecological world. The mountains were now covered in green, the plains were filled with strange trees, and animals swam in the rivers. He stepped into this massive experimental field, eventually selecting a species shaped like a beetle. He released them into a brand new testing area, only 1 square meter in size, and injected the chimpanzee blood before accelerating time. Those that couldn't survive the rejection died instantly. In 2 days, tens of millions of beetle species perished. From the survivors, he selected a small group whose blood fusion was the most successful. He decided to name them the insect apes. Their appearance was remarkably close to humans, though unlike us, they bore circular black armor on their backs. These black jade insect apes took 2 full days to stabilize. In the orchard sandbox, this was the equivalent of 20,000 years passing by. Powerful species began to emerge, trees towered into the clouds, and the birth of massive creatures meant the sandbox had entered a terrifying era similar to the Jurassic. The largest were beasts with black discs on their heads, reaching his set size limit, about the size of a house cat. He released the experimental insect ape tribe into a lush canyon in the south of the sandbox, surrounded by green trees. He wanted to see how they would survive in such a dangerous age. At the same time, he adjusted the sandbox's time flow to a new setting. With time set to a century per day, he rushed to the sandbox early the next morning to observe the insect apes. To his delight, they had already developed primitive tribal structures and even the beginnings of a spoken language. However, he worried that they were simply too fragile. Their ancient genes from 20,000 years ago were no match for the giant beasts of this new era. He couldn't just stand by and watch his hard-earned creation go extinct, so he decided to grant them the sparks of civilization. He quickly ordered a miniature silver crest bonsai and a custom-made alloy sword, crafted with the precision of a needle. By the time these 2 items finally arrived, a day and a half had passed, which, for the insect apes, was a long century and a half. Their numbers had dwindled significantly, leaving them on the brink of extinction. Strangely, he felt a sense of relief. Surviving such a brutal age for so long proved they possessed immense potential. He adjusted the time flow to real time and stepped into the sandbox, finding the tribe's camp in utter ruins. The ground was littered with the fallen. We see several male insect apes letting out low growls, urging the women and children to retreat while they brandished bone clubs against a pack of pitch-black predators known as dark claws. We must survive. The fleeing insect apes seemed to cry out, their faces filled with despair. They appeared accustomed to this life of flight, and the brave males who had charged forward were already being devoured by the dark claws. Blood sprayed like arrows. Watching from a distance, he felt a pang of pity for the heavy losses of this primitive tribe. As he began to stride forward, the fleeing insect apes felt the very earth tremble beneath them. In the ancient, wild forest, countless beasts were startled into flight. An entire species scrambled to escape. Mountains seemed to flatten under his gait, and even the most powerful creatures couldn't react. Before being crushed by a foot descending from the heavens, he quickly caught up with the retreating tribe. The dark claws that had been tearing at the corpses were effortlessly trampled into the dirt. The creatures looked up in terror, wondering what kind of being could be so massive. To them, he was 10,000 times larger than the greatest beasts they knew, capable of killing the dreaded dark claws with a single step. The insect apes turned to gaze at this towering entity, an ancient giant whose head seemed to pierce the very clouds of the sky. They shrieked in awe and collapsed to the ground. He could understand their primitive tongue and felt the weight of their absolute shock. He paid their terror no mind. After all, to them, he was effectively the creator. Run, run, they cried. We can't escape. We see the insect apes collapse in despair, feeling no larger than a single hair on this titan. Amidst the collective screams, one young insect ape stubbornly lifted his head toward the sky and shouted, "You giant beast, are you here to eat us too? You killed my father and mother. You killed Dashio. Why are we so weak?" The child wailed, his voice trembling with grief. He was quite surprised by the young creature's bravery. With a sudden thought, he decided, "You'll do." He gently reached down, lifting the tiny insect ape into his palm. The child's mind went blank. The giant's hand felt like a vast, endless continent. To the creature, he was no larger than a single fine line on a palm. Looking up, the eyes of the towering giant shone like twin suns in the sky. Because he had obscured his true features from the sandbox species, they saw only a blurred face radiating a hazy, divine glow. Holding the tiny creature, he asked calmly, "Gilgamesh, do you wish to change this?" The young insect ape began to tremble violently upon his palm. You can speak?" he shrieked in utter disbelief. "There is actually a giant in this world with wisdom. And why? Why do you call me Gilgamesh?" He held the creature level with his eyes and replied calmly, "A name is one of the first manifestations of wisdom." Standing on the massive palm, Gilgamesh suddenly grew agitated. "If we can communicate, if we are both wise, then why? Why won't you save us? You are so powerful, so magnificent." The insect apes had no idea what he truly was. Viewing him merely as a wise, colossal beast, he didn't bother to explain, instead striding across the mountains and rivers. Forests and creatures were flattened under his gait. He told the weak insect ape in his hand to look down, his voice booming like thunder across the horizon. "Look, in this world, every species is equal. You are no different from any plant or animal. Why should I save only you? Simply because you possess wisdom." Gilgamesh was struck dumb, unable to find an answer. Desperate, the child cried out, "Then why did you come to us?" "No one can save you," he replied. "Do not expect a savior. Only you can save yourselves, but I can give you the tools of civilization to do so." Gilgamesh stood on his hand, listening. Standing on that massive palm, he gazed down in absolute shock. It was his first time seeing the vast earth, mountains, and rivers curling beneath his feet from the height of the clouds. Countless beasts fled and roared below the giant, creating a scene of overwhelming grandeur. This was a magnificent, fantastical view from the heavens, a display of power both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Trembling, the creature asked what civilization truly was. He hadn't initially planned to explain such a concept to this newborn race. But after a moment's thought, he offered an answer. Civilization is a spark. It is knowledge, order, and above all, the mighty power that wise species use to protect themselves. At the mention of mighty power, Gilgamesh seemed to drift into a trance. He placed the creature on his shoulder and strode back to the Great Canyon. There, he took a miniature silver pine he'd bought and planted it in the soil. It was a mere 60 centimeters tall, but to this tiny world, it was a divine tree piercing the very clouds. Looking up, one saw only icy mists and a winding canopy that seemed endless. "If you want the power of civilization, then show your courage and climb this tree. This is your trial, a test of both wisdom and bravery." As he spoke, he placed a custom metal ship and a kerosene-soaked match at the base. After a thought, he placed a capsule at the very top, containing white and silver substances, byproducts from his earlier experiments. His booming voice once again echoed across the horizon. "These are the 3 treasures of civilization. First, the Sword of Judgment, a weapon to protect your people. Unlike the savages roaming the earth, only a species that masters tools can be called wise. Second, the torch, which burns with a scorching flame. It is the bridge that sustains civilization. To master fire is to be enlightened. Third, the blood of power, which only the world's bravest warrior may drink. Survive its baptism, and you will gain peerless strength. Fail, and you will surely die. If you wish to change your destiny, climb the divine tree and claim these treasures before the torch goes out." With that, he gently set the young insect ape back on the ground. While the creature stood there in a daze, he turned and strode away, stepping over mountains. The moment he left the orchard, he accelerated the sandbox's time by 100-fold. Now, a match that burns for only seconds would last for days for the creatures inside. Through his telescope, he watched clearly as the next chapter began. Beneath the divine tree, we see young Gilgamesh, his face set with grim determination as he begins his ascent. To our eyes, the movements of this tiny creature are so swift they are mere blurs. In just a few seconds, he falls countless times, only to struggle back up again. After 10 seconds or so, he finally reaches the very peak of the divine tree. In reality, for Gilgamesh inside the sandbox, he has likely lost count of how long he climbed, or how many times he failed. Standing atop the lush, emerald canopy of the summit, Gilgamesh raises the sword high, seemingly proclaiming something to the heavens before vanishing back down the trunk in a flash. Curious, the creator uses his powers to replay the scene at the top. We see Gilgamesh, having conquered the trial, hoisting the sword of judgment high and swinging it over his head. He gazes down at the living world below, his black bone armor gleaming, his face etched with a new, fierce confidence. He tells himself that since they possess wisdom, they too will one day become like that giant beast. Every member of his tribe will possess divine power and the majesty to make the great beasts flee. He is determined to lead his people to the summit and spread the sparks of civilization across the earth. This moment at the top of the ancient tree is recorded as an eternal turning point. Tens of thousands of years later, long after the prosperity of this land has faded like a passing dream, archaeologists would discover the vivid, epic history written by this great king. This most ancient of documents, the genesis of the Yanli dynasty, records a wise giant 10,000 feet tall with a holy countenance who walked across mountains and rivers to plant the divine tree. The giant set a trial of wisdom and bestowed the 3 treasures of civilization upon the young hero king, Gilgamesh. When the creator wakes up the next morning, a century has already passed within the sandbox world of the orchard. For the insect apes, who live only 40 or 50 years, 2 entire generations have come and gone while he slept. Had the civilization vanished? Not at all. It had provided a grand surprise. In the first decade after he left, Gilgamesh led the insect apes through their continued exodus. He marveled at the wonders of the world, how fire could cook food and ward off great beasts at night, providing warmth in the cold. No wonder the giant said fire represented the origin of civilization. As for the Sword of Judgment, it proved to be an invincible weapon in this primitive forest, and Gilgamesh used it to great effect. The razor-sharp weapon slaughtered countless beasts, allowing his people to finally survive and fight back. By the second decade, Gilgamesh had shed his youthful greenness. Now in his 30s, he had grown tall and imposing, becoming the insect ape tribe's most powerful hunter, hailed by the tribe as the Hero King. He even used fire to clear and fertilize the land, beginning a primitive form of agriculture. He was peerless, arrogant, and domineering, a true sovereign. After all, the giant of wisdom had placed the 3 treasures of civilization in his hands. He understood clearly that civilization is the inheritance of knowledge and history, so he boldly pioneered cuneiform script to record his race's story and innovate their language. Believing himself the first wise soul to open the civilized world, he decided to record his own history of creation in books and hymns, shamelessly naming it Genesis. He was a tyrant, autocratic and dictatorial, yet he possessed an immense personal charisma. Within the tribe, he had 31 wives to bear his offspring. These descendants were mostly strong and powerful, inheriting his stature and wisdom. But since insect apes only live 40 or 50 years, Gilgamesh, now in his late 30s, was reaching his limit. The once wild and bold Hero King, who wielded the Sword of Judgment, was now entering his twilight years. Inside a house crafted from wood, the fireplace blazed brightly. Gilgamesh sat calmly on a massive chair woven from dark claw furs, staring into the flames and muttering to himself. He whispered that this was the flame of civilization bestowed by the giant of wisdom. It was so beautiful and brilliant, almost like dancing crimson petals. Gilgamesh's once massive and powerful frame had grown old and frail. He turned his head to look at the skulls of great beasts hanging on the wall, trophies from across the land. His life had been glorious enough, splendid enough. He had realized the dreams of his youth and felt satisfied. The next tribal leader had already been chosen. His son, Artoria, whose abilities were no less than his own and who could lead the tribe to continued glory. Gilgamesh could clearly feel his life gradually approaching its end. Death is inevitable for all living things, and he had almost resigned himself to it. Then, he silently pulled out the cup of power from all those years ago and sighed, noting that he had no more worries left in this world. He wondered who would be the next bravest warrior. Let us see what becomes of him. The Hero King's clouded eyes widened slightly. In a daze, he recalled the glorious years of his life, and then, quite suddenly, he began to weep. He silently cut his own arm, and onto the open wound, he began to pour the contents of the cup. The blood of power brought an agonizing pain. Gilgamesh struggled, collapsing to the floor. This aging hero had spent his life surviving countless battles, yet he had never gasped in such excruciating torment. Finally, he endured the brush with death and slowly stood up. His long hair had lost its original color, turning a brilliant silver white, and his face was now as perfect and youthful as a god's. Inside the treehouse, the burly, white-haired young man muttered to himself about this newfound strength. This blood of power. What a truly magnificent force it was. At that moment, Gilgamesh could clearly feel a continuous stream of energy surging within his body. Meanwhile, back in the tribe, Gilgamesh's son, Artoria, was standing on high. He raised the Sword of Rupture, announcing his succession as the new leader. Artoria was wise and martial, possessing both talent and virtue. Compared to his tyrannical and arrogant father, he was more like a composed and self-assured sovereign. He was kind and deeply loved, holding enough respect for his father that he never dreamed of seizing the throne. But Gilgamesh, it seems, would not allow any potential threats to remain. He declared his return, asserting that the leadership was still his. On that day, blood was spilled and wails echoed through the Yamli tribe. The Hero King, Gilgamesh, had reclaimed his position as leader, beginning his second life. During the first decade of this new era, he led his people to use stone to build houses. The tribe had officially entered the Stone Age of resistance against the giant beasts. With the blood of power, Gilgamesh now possessed termite genes, allowing him to easily uproot century-old trees with the strength of a mountain. He led his people in rebellion. After 13 years of constant warfare, he chose to challenge the most terrifying existence on this land, a creature said to possess the world's greatest strength, the white giant beast, Finba. Finba was the absolute ruler of this continent's era of giants, the very same creature that had reached the size limit of our sandbox. Gilgamesh fought Finba for 3 days and nights as the earth cracked. Canyons collapsed and countless giant beasts fled the forest in terror. On that day, Gilgamesh returned drenched in blood, one hand gripping the Sword of Rupture, and the other dragging the massive corpse of the white beast, Finba. His strength was so immense that he could pull a creature the size of a mountain alone. The people of the tribe were shaken to their core, filled with a pride so deep they began writing hymns to praise his power. This was history's greatest hero king. At the moment of his return, as he looked upon the people of his tribe, he suddenly declared his intent to found a kingdom. In an instant, the tribe erupted in celebration. People wept with joy, for they knew deep down that under the leadership of this great hero king, their days of wandering were over. They no longer had to fear the brutality of giant beasts. A new era of civilization had begun. History, as we know, is written by the victors. Gilgamesh did not record the atrocities of his earlier years, but instead focused on his legacy. In the chronicles of the Yanli dynasty, the records speak of his parrot and the glory of his reign. These historical epics describe how Gilgamesh used the blood of power to slay the legendary beast Finba and moved massive stones to surround and build the first city-state in history, the city of Vishy, Lishur. As time marched on, Gilgamesh, now unrivaled across the entire land, began to dedicate himself to the development of civilization. He was a charismatic leader, yet he remained an utterly tyrannical and arrogant man. He created currency, perfected language, and built fortified cities, yet he also cruelly divided his people into a strict social hierarchy. He exhausted the people's resources, sending countless warriors to explore the world's boundaries. To his people, he was a great hero king, but he was also an absolute tyrant. By the 87th year of the Yanli dynasty, Gilgamesh had reached the age of 127. The capital city of Lishur had reached a staggering population of tens of millions. Countless slaves were traded here, and arenas were even built for the entertainment of the nobles. The original tribespeople had passed away centuries ago, and as the generations slipped by, their descendants forgot the hardships and struggles of their ancestors. In their comfort, they slowly drifted toward decadence. However, the king of Yanli remained unchanged. Inside the dim and somber royal palace of Lishur, a tall and handsome man stood silently before an exquisite throne of white bone. By his side, never out of reach, was the legendary Sword of Rupture. Great King of Yanli, Lord of the city-state, Your Majesty Gilgamesh, we have finished exploring the entirety of the great land. The Grand Minister of the palace, a man named Han Ming, spoke with a feverish intensity about the vast lands they had charted. As the star envoy, Han Ming recounted the chronicles of their travels over the years, describing the very nature of our world. Gilgamesh stared at the minister, his sharp gaze seemingly piercing through the palace walls to the azure sky beyond. We see the memory of those brave explorers who set out in every direction, spending decades of their lives on this grueling quest. After countless deaths and years of travel, they had finally returned today to reveal the true shape of the entire world. The Earth, it seemed, was a perfect square with a massive ocean at its center, surrounded by mountains and rivers. Across this incredibly vast expanse, even if one were to ride the fastest flying beast in a straight line, it would still take over 20 years to travel between the world's edges. Upon his throne, Gilgamesh remained silent. After a long pause, he simply said, "Very well, you may leave." Han Ming bowed and began to depart. He paused for a moment, turning back to gaze with pure adoration at his king, the great hero king who led them from the caves. He had guided them from the age of farming into the Stone Age, and finally into the era of city-states. He had slain the terrifying beast, the king of monsters, Finba, leading them through one era of civilization after another. 30 years ago, Han Ming was but a young ranger, summoned by His Majesty to map the geography of the realm. He spent 3 decades away before finally returning to the city of Lishur. By the time his mission was complete, he was no longer a youth, but a trembling old man with clouded eyes. He knew he didn't have much longer to live, yet His Majesty remained exactly as he had been in the days of old. There wasn't a single trace of time's passage on the king. Han Ming's body trembled, his eyes filled with a fanatic devotion. For over a century, the king had not needed to display his power, and no one knew just how strong he had truly become. Perhaps this immortal king would lead the Yanli people into the next great era. To be honest, it was a comforting thought. Once the palace was empty, Gilgamesh thought of the phrase, "The sky is round and the earth is square," and sighed deeply. He gently stroked the great sword by his side, as if it were a lover who had accompanied him through endless ages. He had mastered power itself, and the secrets of the blood of power were fully his, yet he had searched the entire world in vain. Nowhere could he find the secret of how his sword was forged. Gilgamesh whispered in shock as he ran his fingers over the blade. He wondered what material this could possibly be. Was it the bone of some ancient beast, or perhaps the craft of a lost civilization? Unfortunately for him, this world was not a complete one. No ores or minerals had been placed within this sandbox by its creator. Because of this, the civilization was destined to remain in the Stone Age forever. In their understanding of the universe, the very concept of metal simply did not exist. To this world, this shiny, indestructible material was something divine. It was mysterious, powerful, and unique. Even after reaching the ends of the earth, he still hadn't found that great being from his past. Yes, even at the world's edge, there was no sign of the one who had changed everything. He searched for the great beast of wisdom, wondering where it could possibly live. The level of civilization that the great beast possessed was simply beyond his imagination. He cherished the sword of rupture that had been gifted to him as his most precious treasure, yet it felt like a silent warning. This holy blade, which had essentially birthed their entire civilization, reminded him of his own limitations. He had only mastered a fraction of the power known as civilization. The rest remained a vast, terrifying unknown. The secret of how this sword was made filled him with a deep sense of dread. The sword of rupture felt like a weight, hanging over his head like a blade that could fall at any moment to take his life, which, to be honest, was a heavy burden for any king. The true power of civilization was something he deeply yearned for. Gilgamesh sat upon his throne like a slumbering lion, his gaze drifting toward the distant horizon. In a daze, his mind wandered back over 100 years to a time long forgotten. He remembered that towering, majestic figure, a giant of impossible proportions, shrouded in a divine and holy radiance. He saw the giant's massive palm cradling his younger self, looking down upon the mountains and rivers as he bestowed the three treasures. It was a scene he could never forget, as vivid as if it had happened only yesterday. But even for a king, time is a cruel master. He felt his life reaching its limit once again. The blood of power, it seemed, no longer had any effect on his aging body. Deep down, he yearned to live a third life, whispering a plea to the great beast of wisdom to see it once more. Unfortunately for him, at that very moment, I was busy chatting and eating dinner with my neighbor's sister, completely unaware of his prayers. Even if I had heard him, I wouldn't have interfered. A life destined to end must eventually face its sunset, for no one is truly immortal. Gilgamesh had already lived a legendary life that even I found enviable, glorious, celebrated, and watched by all. What more could he want? But I underestimated his desperate thirst for life. Having already experienced the terror of death once, he was now utterly consumed by fear. This heroic monarch was determined to forge a third life. By the 102nd year of the Yanli dynasty, things began to change. Gilgamesh was now 142 years old. This legendary king, who had already lived 3 times longer than his subjects, saw his face finally begin to wither. He was struck by a fit of rage and terror, immediately decreeing that the entire nation must find the great beast of wisdom at any cost. He gathered eccentric scholars to brew elixirs and study dark magic. Soon, the primitive forests ran red as countless great beasts were slaughtered. Every part of those creatures was used for experiments. The once flourishing dark claw species was nearly driven to extinction. History had entered the era of tyranny. 13 years later, a court sorcerer finally concocted a longevity potion that successfully extended Gilgamesh's life for a time. However, his body soon developed a resistance, and after several doses, the medicine lost its effect. Gilgamesh began his inevitable slide toward decay. Death is the one thing no living creature can avoid, not even the greatest of heroes. By the 145th year of the Yanli dynasty, another 30 years had passed, and Gilgamesh felt his life force rapidly vanishing. The once mighty old man sat motionless upon his throne. He closed his eyes and muttered to himself, "My life is ending, but I am simply not ready to die yet." After sitting in silence for 3 days, he finally opened his aged eyes, choosing to yield to the passing years and begin the search for a successor. The dynasty was instantly thrown into a feverish state. Their great king was dying. The immortal hero king, Gilgamesh, was finally reaching his end. Yet, strangely enough, no one stepped forward to claim the throne. They all remembered what happened the last time Gilgamesh faced death. Back then, he had named his most trusted son, Artoria, as the next leader, only to kill him with his own hands after regaining his youth. Everyone was terrified of becoming the next Artoria. However, Gilgamesh proved he was still the cleverest of kings by taking a direct approach. He decreed that any candidate for the throne would receive the blood of power, granting them strength comparable to his own. They were told not to fear him, for they would also be granted the right to lead their own followers and establish a second royal city. The promise of the blood and the right to build cities sent shockwaves throughout the entire nation. Merchants, slaves, commoners, and nobles alike swarmed the palace gates. To be honest, the desperation was palpable. Countless men passed the trials only to die when their bodies rejected the blood. Only the forest warrior, Lichidu, and the plains general, Randall, survived. These two endured the blood of power and established their own city-states. Finally, 2 successors worthy of the next generation had appeared. They were prepared to take the mantle from the dying Gilgamesh and guide the Yanli civilization into its next chapter. Civilization had begun with Gilgamesh, but he knew it could not end with him. By the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty, 3 kings ruled together. Under their joint rule, the city-states entered an unprecedented golden age. But then, Gilgamesh felt the cold touch of death finally arrive. In a final, desperate struggle, he summoned his finest craftsmen to build a temple of the great beast of wisdom, even more exquisite than the Hall of Martyrs. Inside the massive stone temple stood a towering statue of a giant god, radiating a sense of vast, celestial light. The giant held the young hero king, Gilgamesh, in a single hand, looking down upon the earth with a piercing blue gaze. The statue emanated a breathtaking, divine aura. On that day, Gilgamesh led his ministers and millions of subjects in a national act of devotion. They worshipped the great beast of wisdom, hoping the great lord would sense their sincerity. He had one final wish before the end. He wanted to see the great beast just one more time. Tears began to stream down Gilgamesh's withered, aged face. Nearly a century had passed, and now, facing his final moments, he led his court in prayer, pleading for a second audience with the beast. He called out to the great beast of wisdom, begging for a chance to meet again. This was the hero king's final, pious ambition. He longed to see the mysterious being who had once gifted him the three treasures of civilization. Death, it seems, changes a man's perspective. While I was out walking with my neighbor's sister, I suddenly received a message from the Creator's mind. Life and death are heavy matters, after all. Feeling a bit sentimental, I decided to go see this old friend. It was also time to put a stop to the Chongyuan clan's interference. In just a few days of accelerated time, they had devastated the sandbox's ecology and wiped out countless species. All of this destruction was for Gilgamesh's dream of immortality. The Creator restored the flow of time to normal and stepped into the sandbox world. For the creatures within, the ground began to vibrate as mountains and rivers trembled. Trees were crushed, massive footprints appeared in the valleys and within the dense forests. Countless beasts fled in terror. Gradually, the entire royal city of martyrs began to shake. Was the city about to collapse? At that moment, Gilgamesh was leading his ministers in worship, and he suddenly sensed a presence. For the first time, the aged face of the great hero king showed the pure excitement of a child. 200 years ago, in his youth, he had seen the great Lord of Wisdom, the one who gifted him the three treasures of civilization. The great beast had finally returned. The Creator gazed down at the massive city, home to 10 million people, with a hint of wonder. Though it was only the size of a basketball court to him, it was a magnificent achievement for the tiny Chongyuan people. He looked down at the exquisite altars and temples. Beneath the tall stone statue, the snow-white, elderly hero king looked up, clutching the E8 arrow and weeping tears of gold and silver. The Creator stared at the crying old man. With a touch of melancholy, he remembered the young, green creature he once held in his palm, the boy who stood atop the giant tree, roaring at the sky with his arrow. Now, he had reached the end of his days. To be honest, it felt like that ambitious youth was there only yesterday. Gilgamesh, have these years been good to you? The Creator asked softly. His voice pierced through the vast layers of clouds, descending upon the bustling city below. Gilgamesh trembled violently. My lord, I have fared well enough, he replied, his throat dry and raspy as he gazed at the giant in the sky. Even though it wasn't the first time he had seen him, he was still moved by the sight of the titan piercing the heavens. The giant's torso seemed to hold up the world, his face obscured by a dense, holy radiance that made his features indistinguishable. The majestic figure looked down upon the city of martyrs, radiating a divine presence that no words could truly describe. The beauty of the scene was overwhelming. It was real. It actually existed. Across the city, 10 million people, from merchants in fine leather to slaves in tattered rags, stopped their work. Every commoner and craftsman stepped out of their homes and into the streets, looking up at the vast giant that filled the sky. This was the legendary great beast of wisdom who had gifted them civilization, a titan standing tens of thousands of feet tall. To them, he was a life form as grand and eternal as the sun, moon, and stars. Everyone was immersed in a state of shock, their minds blank with awe and fear. These complex emotions eventually intertwined and transformed into unparalleled adoration. Gilgamesh looked at the stunned expressions of his palace ministers and couldn't help but let out a dry laugh. He remembered having that exact same feeling of terror when he first met the great beast. After a long silence, Gilgamesh looked up with eyes full of longing. Great beast of wisdom, he whispered, his gaze fixed on the heavens. He told the giant that he had fulfilled the legacy of civilization entrusted to him over a century ago. From high above, the Creator's voice seemed to travel across time itself, piercing the clouds to reach the royal city of martyrs below. He told the king that his achievements would be recorded in the bloody and rigorous epic of Genesis. In the history of their civilization, he would be known as the greatest first-generation hero king. Future generations would compose hymns for him, and for thousands of years, his glory would live on through oral epics. That is not what I want, Gilgamesh suddenly interrupted, his voice growing agitated. When asked what he truly desired, he confessed he wanted eternal life, just like the giant before him. Looking up at the titan piercing the clouds, he was consumed by desire. He was willing to sacrifice everything and pay any price, if only he could be granted the treasure of immortality. The Creator remained silent. At this moment, the king possessed almost everything the world could offer: glory, power, wealth. Even the world itself belonged to him. And yet, he was still not satisfied. To be honest, the Creator understood that hunger for longevity. He himself was facing a terminal illness. He envied Gilgamesh's magnificent life, A life that read like a grand epic. Gilgamesh, you are too greedy, the creator thought. I do not possess the treasure of immortality. He gazed calmly at the aging king. The cycle of birth, aging, and death was a law of nature that even he could not change. At the end of life, the desire to survive is a law that cannot be rewritten. In that final moment, status and rank are stripped away entirely. The scales of countless civilizations are crossed, yet whether one is an emperor or a mere ant, the end remains the same. Eventually, everyone is reduced to dust and bone. The creator took one last deep look at Gilgamesh, then gazed down at the dynasty with profound emotion. Impossible, Gilgamesh rasped, his voice barely a whisper as he stared up at the divine face shrouded in the high clouds. No, you are lying to me. You can do it. I know you can do it. His eyes burned with a desperate, frantic heat. He looked at the giant's body, towering like a mountain range and as robust as solid rock. After more than 200 long years, even he, who had consumed the blood of power, had grown old, yet time had left no mark whatsoever on this magnificent titan. To the giant, time seemed to stand still, making the great beast of wisdom appear truly immortal. What a terrifyingly powerful force that was. It was a longevity so vast it invited only envy. Gilgamesh's lips trembled, and he suddenly threw his head back and roared in fury. Did you come here at my call just to witness my death? To watch a humble, pathetic life shiver and wither away from old age? The creator replied that he had come only to see him off, possessing no power to extend a mortal's lifespan. To be honest, it was a cold truth. I am also here for the second handover of civilization, and to give a warning. The creator sighed, his voice echoing through the city. He told the king that their civilization had become too brutal, exterminating creatures, destroying forests, and slaughtering the great beasts of the earth. True civilization is neither cruelty nor barbarism. He demanded that the killing stop immediately. Yes, a tall order for a conqueror. Though aged, Gilgamesh remained remarkably strong. He stood up with a shudder, his eyes igniting like a fire that only grew more intense. This white-haired old man suddenly took a bold step forward, his spirit surging. The slaughter cannot be stopped, he declared defiantly. And my own footsteps will not stop either. Do you have any idea how I have felt all these years? He spoke of the sword of separation the giant had given him. It had hung over his head like a constant shadow. It brought him power, but it also brought an unparalleled, lingering fear. And today, he shouted, I shall personally draw this sword that hangs above me. He called for his historians, those responsible for the epic of Genesis, to step forward and record this very moment for all of history. He declared that he would speak the history of civilization while they wrote it down. On a dark red platform, the historian Ming silently lifted his quill and spread a scroll. The parchment, made of gray beast hide, waited for the king to speak. He began by saying that the history of humanity's struggle against nature is one of courage and a history of hymns. He explained that his original intention in commissioning the epic of Genesis was to preserve their legacy for those who would come after. Now, he wanted history to record his courage in this very moment, so that future generations would understand the spirit of their ancestors who fought against nature. Gilgamesh took a heavy, ragged breath, his aged body trembling as he leaned against the sword of separation. He began to laugh, a low and guttural sound. Then, raising his voice, he proclaimed, in the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty, over a century after crowning himself a hero by slaying the legendary beast Finba, the great king Gilgamesh strikes once more. He had used the strength of the entire nation to lure the lofty beast of wisdom into appearing before him. His goal was simple, yet terrifying, to swing his sword and slay the great beast of wisdom. We watch as the creator looks down in silence, his heart a storm of complexity. Last time, it was a son. This time, the king intended to challenge a god. To be honest, it was a development that even a creator might find startling. However, the creator soon regained his calm. He looked at Gilgamesh's actions and realized that this defiance was perhaps inevitable for a man of his nature. This was the man who had personally killed his most beloved son. Now, facing death for the second time, he chose to turn his blade against his own benefactor. He was swinging his sword at the one who had granted him the three treasures of civilization. Perhaps, deep down, the creator should have seen this coming. He remembered choosing a brave young ape from a shivering crowd, one who dared to roar and question a giant. He should have known what that spirit implied. In his entire life, Gilgamesh had never known the meaning of fear. For him to swing his sword at a god now was, in a strange way, perfectly natural. It was simply who he was. With a calm expression, the creator gave one last warning. Gilgamesh, I am telling you for the final time, stop this madness. This is not civilization, it is barbarism. Your next move will carry a price far more heavy than you can possibly imagine. But the king simply replied that no price was heavier than death itself. Gilgamesh slowly opened his blood-red eyes, looking as sharp as they did in his youth. It was as if he had returned to his younger days, filled with a long-lost, frantic passion. He recalled the time he faced the beast Finba with a heart prepared to die. Today, he declared, I shall slay the beast of wisdom. I will seize his civilization and steal his very power to achieve true immortality. He vowed to lead his people into a new era, fueled by the strength of a god. And so, the conqueror prepared for his final, most impossible battle. A mortal challenges a god as Gilgamesh lets out a powerful roar, marking the very first collision between two different civilizations. He shouted that while the creator once guided their progress, he was now the only obstacle standing in their way. He raised his sword high, as the wild winds whipped through his messy, silver-white hair. At that exact moment, a distant bell echoed throughout the entire royal city. The city of martyrs erupted in a frenzy, and an army of hundreds of thousands surged forth, forming a dense and perfectly ordered formation. We see the creator sigh at this sight, realizing that Gilgamesh had been preparing to strike the beast of wisdom for over a decade. Today was merely the catalyst. If the creator hadn't appeared or refused his terms, the king would have led his men to kill him anyway. Brave, yet calculating. From this perspective, he truly was a magnificent tyrant. Meanwhile, on the distant plains of the great city, the barbarian General Randall stood calmly before his palace. Even from such a vast distance, he could see the giant towering into the clouds. He was struck by the majesty of such a perfect, colossal life form, feeling a mix of awe and a deep, trembling fear. It was time to act. Given King Gilgamesh's dictatorial and arrogant nature, he never would have shared the precious blood of strength with others, unless he desperately needed allies. He had planned for this moment from the very start. Randall suddenly drew his long sword, displaying the fierce spirit of the plains people as he shouted for the march to begin. History, he claimed, would remember this great moment. In the 175th year of the Yanli dynasty, the Yanli people would slay the beast of wisdom and return with the gift of eternal life. Near the capital, we find the divine tree, the ancient pillar that once reached the heavens to test the three treasures of civilization. A bustling forest city had been built atop this ancient tree, and at its very peak, the forest warrior Likidu leaned on his wooden staff. He watched the horizon in silence, his expression unreadable as the winds of war began to gather around them. When a subordinate reminded him that promises should be kept, Likidu simply replied that the forest city would choose to do nothing at all. He sighed, for even from this distance, the terrifying pressure radiating from the giant at the royal city made it difficult for him to breathe. An honest disciple asked if he was afraid, noting that if the three strongest kings of the dynasties joined forces, even a legend might fall. Likidu shook his head, claiming it wasn't fear that stayed his hand, though his eyes betrayed a much deeper, more cautious concern. He wasn't afraid of death, but rather of discarding something far more precious than life itself. His civilization and wisdom taught him that he could not slaughter like a brutal beast the very being who had gifted them civilization and saved their entire race. To abandon gratitude and morality would make them no different from wild animals. His disciples remained silent at these words. Their teacher was one of the three strongest leaders, a great forest hero who had survived by accepting the blood of strength. Yet now, he chose to defy the royal decree. Since his refusal to fight was an unpardonable sin, he ordered them to take his head. If the king emerged victorious, they were to carry his head to the palace as proof of his defiance against the crown. Under the king's dictatorial tyranny, he was a dead man anyway. He insisted this was his decision alone, a heavy burden to bear. He begged that the city be spared from the king's wrath, but if the beast of wisdom won, they should offer his head to the giant instead. They would pray for the great giant's forgiveness, showing him that there were still true inheritors of civilization among them. He wanted the giant to know they weren't just pure barbarians, hoping to secure a single spark of hope for their race's survival. Standing atop the divine tree, Likidu spread his arms wide. After a moment of heavy silence, a disciple steeled his heart. Blood bloomed as he personally took Likidu's head. One of the strongest heroes of the Yanli civilization had met his end. The forest king, Likidu, offered no resistance before he died. The disciple gazed at the calm, familiar face of his master's severed head. He silently wrapped it in animal hide, feeling a sudden, sharp ache in his heart. Something incredibly important was slowly shattering. Back at the capital, countless archers and cavalry swarmed the ground. This was Yanli's finest army, though they looked like mere ants. Their arrows were sharp, but their strength was lacking. Their swords and spears struck the creator's denim jeans. Without even touching his skin, it seemed even the most elite army couldn't pierce through his strange, otherworldly clothing. Gilgamesh realized he should have guessed this. The elite troops that had conquered forests and beasts were useless against the giant. Just as those words left his lips, Gilgamesh realized that conventional warfare would achieve absolutely nothing here. Suddenly, Gilgamesh made a powerful leap, and in the blink of an eye, he had lunged forward to strike at the creator's knee. As we watch, the creator is genuinely surprised by the sheer speed of the attack. It's truly impressive. How could an ant-like being possess the explosive jumping power of a flea? This was no simple feat. He swiped his hand to swat the intruder, but surprisingly, the hero King Gilgamesh managed to dodge the blow while maintaining his incredible momentum. Gilgamesh darted left and right with fluid agility, beginning to scale the creator's denim jeans. His expression, however, remained incredibly grim. This was the beast of wisdom. He realized that the mere wind generated by the giant's movements was enough to nearly blow him away. Just then, a voice called out to the king. The barbarian General Randall arrived to provide support. With a light, powerful leap, he cleared 7 or 8 meters in a single bound to scale the giant's leg. As the creator reached out to grab him, Randall faced a palm as vast and unstoppable as a mountain gale. To be honest, the scale of the struggle was almost absurd. Yet the barbarian was equally nimble. Having fought giant beasts for countless years, his combat skills were honed to perfection, living up to his reputation as a legendary warrior. The creator acknowledged their skill, but decided the test had reached its end. He suddenly thrust his palm forward with blinding speed toward Randall. Randall's face paled as he realized he couldn't possibly react in time. In an instant, he was sent flying. A second later, the creator swung his palm again. With overwhelming force, he aimed a strike at Gilgamesh. The king's eyes widened in shock as he realized the sheer inevitability of the blow. Reacting in a split second, Gilgamesh swung his sword in a brilliant, desperate arc to block. But as the palm collided with the blade, his defense shattered. He was sent spiraling through the air, falling rapidly toward the earth. It had taken only a single move to defeat him. He realized, with a start, that he had barely scratched the giant. Yes, after all that effort, he had only managed to graze the giant's skin. Crashing into the ground, Gilgamesh could only manage a bitter, painful smile. He coughed up a mouthful of blood as the creator looked down at this remarkable man with a sense of admiration. Despite his defeat, he had shown no fear. Even knowing the gap between them was as vast as the heavens, he stood firm. Gilgamesh was a complex, powerful man, possessed of an undeniable personal charisma. He was arrogant and tyrannical, a true autocrat, yet seeing such a hero at the end of his days stirred a quiet sense of pity and regret within the creator. Unfortunately, the end of the king's natural lifespan was something even a god could not change. Nearby, Randall was also coughing up blood, his chest heaving violently. He stared up at the giant in the sky, and like his king, his eyes held no terror. He had accepted the possibility of death from the very beginning. A true warrior of the plains never fears the end. He simply laughed bitterly, finally understanding the sheer scale of the being they had tried to wage war against. The creator sighed softly, his massive form beginning to glow with a radiant, golden light that seemed to fill the entire horizon. The giant stood tall, his head piercing the clouds like a majestic, ancient pillar. Was there regret? No, he told himself. This was simply the result of a choice. Gilgamesh coughed up more blood, unable to find the words. In this moment, we see a civilization forced to admit defeat before the sheer scale of the beast of wisdom. They had challenged the vastness of a god and failed. They knew exactly what this meant. A world-ending disaster was about to descend upon them all. We look toward the retreating army, where the air is thick with frantic screams. The members of this dying race wail in a chorus of pure, unadulterated terror. Some were laughing in a state of total despair, clearly driven to madness. The creator had never intended to hold the fate of so many in his hands. To be honest, presiding over the rise and fall of an entire civilization was a heavy burden. He looked down at the aging hero king and waited for him to speak. Gilgamesh spoke softly, his voice barely a whisper. He asked if they would face destruction now, just as they had destroyed countless other giant beast races. He wondered if the giant would wipe them out to avenge those fallen species. The creator watched him quietly, observing the end of an era. Even as his civilization stood on the brink of ruin, the king showed no fear. After a moment of reflection, the creator replied that since they ignored his warnings, he would indeed destroy them. They had shattered the world's ecological balance and driven too many species to extinction. He could no longer allow them to multiply without limit. Hearing this, Gilgamesh gave a smile of quiet resignation. He recalled the giant's past answer about what civilization truly was, and asked for a few final answers. It was a surreal sight, their king, at the very end, asking the beast of wisdom for one last lesson, which, naturally, made everyone nearby stop in their tracks. The surrounding crowd held their breath, looking up at the 10,000-foot giant. The air grew heavy and silent for several long seconds. The beast remained silent at first. Then, a profound voice pierced through the vast layers of clouds, falling upon the shattered remains of the martyr's capital. The giant told him to speak his questions. In an instant, the world seemed to fall into a deathly hush, and the blood-soaked earth became eerily still. Countless fleeing soldiers stopped and turned back to gaze at the giant in the sky. Gilgamesh asked what method would be used to destroy them. The creator thought for a moment before calmly stating that he would use water. He would bring forth a massive, cleansing flood. The waters would wash away and submerge their entire civilization, erasing every footprint they had ever left behind. The earth seemed to hold its breath. Everyone stood as silent as cicadas in winter. The thought of their entire history being drowned in an instant was almost too much to comprehend. The ground had become too filthy, stained by the actions of a desperate people. And so, the beast of wisdom would use a great flood to start anew. The beast intended to cleanse this land of its sinful inhabitants. But even for the mighty beast of wisdom, how could it possibly trigger a flood covering the entire world? This was no longer just the power of a beast. Their breathing grew shallow, their faces pale with shock. They simply couldn't find a single word to describe this legendary creature. Gilgamesh then asked his second question. Why were there no footprints of the giant in this world? Where did he truly come from? This world was vast, yet the giant's origins remained a complete mystery to them all. What kind of existence was the beast of wisdom, really? Why had he handed them the sparks of civilization in the first place? And why stop them from slaughtering other races? He claimed all living things were equal, the savage species, the intelligent ones, and even the plants. If everything was equal, then what did this land actually represent to him? The king looked up, desperate for a final truth. The creator lowered his head slightly to look at this fallen hero king. From his height, he overlooked the entire martyr's capital as his vast voice shook the earth. He told them that this land was a world of his own creation. Every one of them was his subject, the savage, the wise, and the plants alike. To him, every species was equal because they were all his children. In that moment, the very air of the seasons seemed to freeze solid. The people on the ground began to gasp for air. This sound of labored breathing spread, growing into a frantic, rhythmic chorus of desperation. Even the most stoic among them lost their voices in a state of pure disbelief. Suddenly, Gilgamesh began to laugh, a sound that felt entirely out of place. His laughter grew louder and more unrestrained, turning into a wild, arrogant roar. It was interesting, truly, pathologically interesting to him now. He wondered what they had actually been fighting against all this time. The legendary beast of wisdom wasn't just a giant animal, as they had assumed. It wasn't a beast at all. He was the almighty Lord of all things, the one who had brought everything into existence from nothingness. He was the creator of the world, an existence that could only be described by one word, God, a concept they had never known until now. The tribal people of this land had never possessed the concept of a god, but here he was. Gilgamesh realized his own staggering arrogance. He had once boldly titled the records of his own history Genesis, believing he was the one who had created the civilized world. In reality, the true creator was the beast of wisdom, and all living things were merely his children. It was a power of unimaginable scale. To think he had tried to challenge such a being. Gilgamesh's voice cut off abruptly, followed only by the echo of his fading laughter. His laughter soared toward the sky, growing more unrestrained by the second. Meanwhile, the towering giant stood silent, his massive form reaching into the clouds. Standing at the edge of the royal city, the creator watched this dying hero king with a quiet, patient gaze. He was, by nature, quite tolerant of such outbursts. He allowed the king this final moment of defiance. Then, Gilgamesh suddenly asked one last question. How many days did it take to create their world? The question caused the giant to pause in reflection. To be honest, transforming the orchard into this sandbox had been quite the undertaking. It had involved moving vast amounts of earth and laboring over the details. The creator remembered the effort required to shape the foundations of this land. Between hauling soil and sculpting the mountains and rivers, it had taken exactly 1 week to complete the transformation. And so, he answered truthfully. He told the king that it took 7 days to create this land. 7 days to create everything they had ever known. Gilgamesh was stunned. He collapsed, laughing until tears filled his eyes, a hysterical sound that echoed with a strange, desperate intensity. In that moment, it felt as if something deep inside him finally shattered. His pride and arrogance were ground into dust at the very end of his life. 7 days. As his consciousness began to fade into the laughter, he found himself remembering a moment from his childhood, standing in a giant palm. He remembered the first question he had ever asked the giant. What is civilization? He was told it was fire, knowledge, and above all, order. It was the greatest power of wisdom, meant for protection. Now, Gilgamesh's laughter grew even louder, carrying across the winds and the ridges. It traveled over the rivers and through the forests. Across the land, the primitive inhabitants looked up in a daze, as if they could all feel the shift. It was as if they heard the final, tragic song of their king. Countless people began to weep and wail, singing ancient, nameless laments for their leader. The folk songs turned into a mournful chorus for the fall of a great ruler. On this day, at the edge of the martyr's capital, the epic of a hero reached its end. Gilgamesh finally passed into the dust of history. The creator sighed, watching the departure of this king who had tried so hard to understand the world. The truth was, the creator had never intended to compete for anything. Every question asked had been answered with complete honesty. But he simply didn't have the power to grant eternal life. He was, in his own way, facing his own end, making the king's struggle seem all the more tragic. The king was dead, and the battle was lost. The people fled in a panic, crying out in grief, while the giant looked down silently upon the chaos. Where could they possibly run? To the very edge of the world? It was truly an unbelievable sight as the royal historians recorded the city's sorrow. From atop the towering walls, a royal historian watched the great hero king collapse and die. Having learned the terrifying truth, he was drenched in a cold sweat. He told himself he must record everything before his own end. He had to leave the truth about the world for future generations. His body trembled as sweat soaked his sleeves. He had only just finished recording Gilgamesh's heroic feat of challenging the giant of wisdom. Immediately after, he shakily turned to the next page to begin a new chapter, the genesis of the Yanli kingdom. He recorded that the giant was actually the creator, and that Gilgamesh, in his arrogant later years, dared to swing his sword at the Lord. The king had sought eternal life through divine blood, finally enraging the heavens. Seeing the great sins of man, God decided to destroy the Yanli civilization. A world-ending flood was to be sent to wipe out all life. The sky shook and the earth wailed as an atmosphere of dread gripped the capital. People were restless, trembling in a fever of panic. They cried out to repent, fearing God would crush their arms and break their backs. They believed the great flood would destroy their world and erase their civilization. And it was at this very moment that a blond youth carrying a bundle appeared. The young man approached the creator's feet and opened his bundle to reveal a severed head. He shouted that the forest king, Lichidu, begged for forgiveness. The creator paused, noticing that of the 3 kings, only 2 had come. The forest king was missing, having sent this messenger instead. The youth knelt, pressing himself firmly against the ground. He pleaded for mercy, claiming the Yanli people were not merely barbarians. He explained that his mentor, Lichidu, had already proven this through his own death. It was a heavy price to pay, to be sure. Lichidu had chosen to defy the king's orders rather than swing a sword at the benefactor who gave them civilization. They were not all evil. He begged that when the divine judgment descended, a single spark of life be left for the Yanli people. The creator listened to the story of the forest king. He sighed softly. To be honest, he had never expected Gilgamesh to be so mad, nor had he ever truly intended to exterminate them all. But they had become far too arrogant. Such insane challenges, unreasonable tyranny, and barbarism eventually required a price to be paid. The creator commanded the youth to lead his people and use great magic to build an ark. They were to save at least 1 pair of every creature. The remaining space was for the worthy people of Lichidu's forest. The creator announced he would bring the great flood immediately. As he turned to leave, the air was filled with the sounds of trembling and excitement. They had lost the war, but perhaps not their entire future. We see that a spark of hope remained for the species, and those thanking the creator knew it was all thanks to the forest king. Lichidu's sacrifice had changed everything. The royal historian, weeping with joy, watched the giant's departing figure and began writing feverishly in the Genesis chapter of the Yanli kingdom. He recorded how the kindness of Forest King Lichidu moved the god who intended to destroy the world, sparing the defiant Yanli people. God commanded them to build an ark to escape the great flood. Meanwhile, we return to the courtyard where our protagonist is busy. He tidied up and found a high-pressure water gun in the corner of the garden, bought recently while shopping with little sister Suchin. He hadn't expected it to come in handy so soon. In the 10 minutes it took him to prepare, 120 days passed in the sandbox. Countless people became blurred shadows of motion, felling the ancient bonsai tree to build a massive ark. They gathered seeds of every plant and younglings of every giant beast, concentrating the world's entire biodiversity into this one vessel. Fortunately, the area was small and they lived close together. It was time to begin the cleaning. He stepped toward the sandbox from several meters away. He raised the high-pressure water gun and began a steady sweep, spraying a white torrent toward the city-state civilization in the orchard. Great trees fell and massive cities collapsed instantly. Countless beasts fled the forest, trying to outrun the towering white flood behind them. But they were eventually submerged as the world changed color in an instant. The youth, leading his people, sat upon the ark. They watched the sky in absolute shock. It was a terrifying sight, as if the very fountains of the great deep had been unleashed. The windows of heaven were opened, and countless rushing white streams poured down from the clouds to wash over the entire land. Except for the ark floating upon the waves, the entire world was now submerged in a vast expanse of white foam. The flood fell like a magnificent white waterfall from the peak of the heavens, rushing down to swallow the mountains and rivers. What terrifying power it was. In a mere moment, the great flood that would destroy the world had descended upon them. On the deck, merchants, nobles, commoners, and slaves watched in breathless awe. These were the kindest and most peaceful of their kind. God had sent the flood to cleanse the sinful land. The barbaric, the tyrannical, and the guilty would all perish in the torrent. As the world was submerged, this day of the great flood became known as the Day of Disaster, the final twilight of the Yanli civilization. The survivors followed their leader onto the last ark to escape the deluge. In a quiet corner of the vessel, a humble official sat, clutching a quill and collapsing onto the deck in a daze. He remained lost in the memory of that magnificent, divine figure. He believed their world was a vast plane created by God in just 7 days, a display of power so grand it was hard to fathom. Trembling with emotion, the elderly historian began to fill in the gaps of the creation story with his own inspired thoughts. He put pen to paper, recording the final account of the 7 days of creation. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God divided the light from the darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. On the second day, the work continued. God decreed that there should be an expanse to separate the waters, and thus the heavens were formed above the world. On the third day, God commanded the waters under the heavens to be gathered together so that dry land might appear. God called the dry land earth and the gathered waters seas. Then came the 4th, 5th, and 6th days of labor. By the 7th day, everything in heaven and earth was complete. God rested, blessing the work of the previous 6 days. In the years that followed, people accepted this historian's vision as absolute truth, as if the Creator had truly explained it all to them. To be honest, it is unlikely a god would lower himself to explain the mechanics of creation to mortals, but people preferred the story. In this tale, God rested on the seventh day, which the people named the Sabbath or Holy Day. It became a lasting custom of the land. Even now, people choose to rest on that day. Meanwhile, our protagonist finished spraying the area, ensuring no spot was missed. He clicked off the high-pressure water gun and returned it to the storage room. The sandbox had been reset, the cycle starting anew. Overpopulation had nearly ruined the ecosystem, but with one pair of each species remaining, the balance would eventually return. He hoped that this time, they would be more cautious. Beside him, the creator AI noted that without this intervention, they would have destroyed themselves. They would have consumed every species and faced extinction anyway. A forced rebirth was perhaps a kinder fate. He let out a long sigh, telling the AI he wasn't as fragile as it thought, though deep down, his heart felt heavy. The creator AI continued its cold analysis, its voice echoing in the quiet room. As the empress of the Chong dynasty who birthed countless races, it argued, he should be used to this. He felt a vain throb in his temple and corrected the AI, firmly reminding it that he was a man. The AI ignored him, insisting that as the progenitor, population control was vital for the world's balance. He cut the AI off, sitting in his courtyard to quietly eat some fruit he had just peeled. With his stomach cancer, he told himself he needed to be kinder to his body and eat better. He picked up his black notebook to record the end of the giant beast era, or the beast Cretaceous. Since the Yanli people recorded it as Genesis, he decided to officially name this era the Genesis era. On Earth, dinosaurs were wiped out by a meteorite. Here, a flood had cleansed the world of giants. He organized his thoughts, turning past the records of the Dark, Sea, and Cenozoic eras to a new page. He wrote, Fourth Era, Genesis. Wisdom emerged, and the Chung people built a civilization that drove out the beasts. But their cruelty grew too great to tolerate, and so a great flood was sent to destroy all life. This third mass extinction wiped out 99% of all living species in the sandbox world. After finishing his notes, he went to sleep, only to wake the next morning feeling a terrifying power. Startled, he began to examine his own body, wondering where this surging strength had come from. Looking in the mirror, he saw he had grown several centimeters taller, reaching a height of 183. His features had become refined and handsome, his physique now resembling a perfect Greek sculpture. This was the feedback power from the third extinction, infinitely stronger than the previous two rewards. He felt like a top-tier athlete, his fists full of explosive energy, yet his beauty was almost otherworldly. Looking like a Nordic god was a bit much, and he worried how he would explain this to Su Qin. He worried Su Qin would think he was using some extreme photo editing filter, or worse, that he'd end up as a lab specimen. Suddenly, he asked the creator AI if he could modify his own genes. He wanted the AI to revert these blatantly superior physical traits back to his original appearance, just to keep things simple. If he changed too much at once, suspicion would surely follow. As the creator, he possessed the natural ability to modify genes, the power of the Chong race. A Chong hero can modify their own genetic fragments. He wondered if he should fully integrate the Chong cells, realizing that, in a way, he was already one of them. Previously, his body was too weak to handle the transformation, but now that he was stronger, he could finally accept the Chong cells. He didn't hesitate over the choice of whether to remain human. After all, how long could he wait when his life was already on the line? Now that his physique was powerful enough, he was ready to accept the Chong cells and move forward. He saw no point in waiting for cancer to claim him just to stay normal. Being a regular human wasn't exactly exciting anymore, was it? Being a bug seemed far more interesting. And so, he quietly gave the command to integrate the Chong cells. The fusion began instantly, reaching deep into his soul. A tearing, agonizing pain surged through him. Drenched in a cold sweat, he collapsed onto the bed, crying out in pain before finally losing consciousness. 3 hours passed before he finally came to. Covered in a layer of dark, grimy residue, he hurried to wash up and change his clothes before returning to inspect the results. He examined himself and found his body had been transformed, filled with limitless potential. He was now a true member of the Chong, possessing their unique biological traits. With the talent for accelerated cell division, he could now regulate his genes at will. Closing his eyes, he visualized a black space where he could see his own essence. He saw a twisting double helix of DNA. The vast amount of junk information in his human genome had been cleared out, leaving only the optimized, essential fragments. Most of the genetic chain was now a blank canvas. However, when he attempted to excise the cancer cells, the creator AI provided a cold, disappointing response. The AI informed him that those cells were now a fundamental part of his genetic makeup and could not be removed. He took a deep breath, realizing he had to find another way to heal. The creator AI then revealed a terrifying fact. Cancer cells are the body's own rebels. The stronger the host becomes, the more powerful the rebellion grows. This meant that as he grew stronger, the cancer cells grew stronger too, multiplying frantically within his body. A bit of a double-edged sword, to be sure. If he had absorbed any more power from this mass extinction, the strain might have killed him outright. The realization gave him quite a shock. He understood now that he couldn't accept the feedback from a fourth mass extinction anytime soon. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for the caution he now had to exercise. In the short term, even if the inhabitants of his sandbox world became unruly or violent, he couldn't simply wipe the slate clean again. He would have to be patient. He realized that for a while, even if the inhabitants of this land became unruly or violent, he couldn't simply wipe them out to start over. Recalling Gilgamesh's desperate struggle before death the previous night, he felt a renewed sense of terror and awe regarding his own mortality. His stomach cancer had progressed from the middle to the late stages, and death is, after all, what every living creature fears most. He stood up and walked toward the courtyard gate. With terminal cancer, time was a luxury he simply didn't have much of anymore. He had to quickly deduce racial civilizations and extraordinary powers within the sandbox to find a way to combat those rebellious cancer cells. Looking at the sandbox, we see a world where everything has withered. Though 50 years had passed inside overnight, life had yet to fully recover. With only a single pair of each species remaining, they were slowly multiplying, finally heeding the gods' warning that all living beings are equal. Aside from hunting for necessary food, they reduced unnecessary killing and even helped other species expand their populations. A touching sentiment, really. At the same time, strange new species began to emerge from the ruins of the mass extinction, like fresh sprouts appearing after a storm. Things had stabilized and begun to develop again, but it was still too slow. He sighed, knowing his illness wouldn't wait for nature's pace. He wondered if he should open a second sandbox for a new genesis, creating another world to evolve and develop extraordinary systems. However, that seemed a bit unrealistic, considering the current large sandbox had only just shown the first tiny sprouts of supernatural power. Realizing he shouldn't bite off more than he could chew, he changed his approach. Wisdom is unpredictable and often defies the standard laws of evolution. Since that was the case, he thought it might be wise to borrow the intelligence of others. Thinking alone was proving to be far too limited. It was time for a bit of brainstorming. He decided it would be much more efficient to bring a group of people into his little project. Yes, this time he wanted to take a big gamble. Evolving species by himself was simply moving at a snail's pace. It would be better to have others help him deduce the evolution of organisms. He remembered the sandbox games he used to play as a hobby. In those games, players start as simple spores and evolve into complex creatures. He wondered if he could turn a miniature sandbox into an online game. If others could enter through a device and treat the sandbox as a game, they could evolve new species for him. A clever shortcut, indeed. With his current technology, it was possible, though traditional leveling up wouldn't exist. He nodded. After all, this was a real world, not a simulation. He envisioned an open sandbox, much like Minecraft, where players could start with cell division accelerated 10,000 times, beginning as simple spores. They would control their own evolution, growing and dying to evolve new species, completing a full cycle of life in just 2 or 3 days. This was just a sudden, whimsical little design that wouldn't require too much energy. His main focus remained on the primary large sandbox. From there, he planned to select the best results from each session of their game. It was a clever way to crowdsource the future of his world. He knew that letting one intelligent race dominate could easily destroy the sandbox. He estimated he could set this up in about 3 days using existing VR technology. Using VR as the medium, he cleared a 30-square-meter area in front of his house to serve as this new, smaller sandbox. He picked up his hoe and, following his previous layout, skillfully began creating the environment. His body felt surprisingly capable despite his condition. Though the terminal illness still lingered within him, he found the strength to work. A day later, the environment for the small sandbox was complete. Meanwhile, a veteran Steam player named Chun Wenshan was hunting for niche new titles when he stumbled upon a curious discovery. It was a VR beta called Spore Evolution, described as a sandbox farming game where one starts as a single spore with infinite possibilities. The description claimed it was the top choice for casual players. At first, he scoffed at the idea, thinking it was just another gimmick. He suspected it was just a developer trying to grab attention, but the massive 73-gigabyte file size piqued his curiosity. After downloading and registering, he put on his VR headset and entered the game. He was shocked to find he could actually feel his own limbs. It felt as though he were truly swimming in an ocean. When Sean's mind went blank for a moment until he realized the scale of what he was seeing. Initially, he couldn't see anything at all because he was still in a spore state, a single-celled organism that needed to evolve eyes first. He died countless times, breeding through generations until he finally evolved eyes and a mouth to begin hunting. However, he was quickly wiped out again. His eyes were too weak to spot predators, leading to constant ambushes. To solve this, he actually went to a library to research biological evolution. Half a day later, he finally evolved a species that could barely survive, a mass of sticky tentacles surrounding a giant, venomous eye. Beneath it sat a small mouth filled with sharp teeth. When Sean felt a surge of pride, he had finally succeeded in creating life. We see when Sean controlling his tentacled monster as it crawls onto the shore, completely awestruck by the realistic mountains and rivers, while our protagonist is simply at his front gate. He was munching on an apple and soaking up the sun when he spotted the bizarre creature crawling onto the bank. He was instantly baffled by such a strange evolutionary choice. The creature's eye was terrifyingly large, taking up 2/3 of its entire body. One has to wonder just how obsessed this player was with the concept of sight. According to the laws of evolution, wasting most of one's nutrients on a uselessly oversized eyeball should lead to natural extinction, but he found the design rather amusing. It looked less like a biological organism and more like a blood-eyed demon from ancient myths. Just then, a knocking sound came from the gate. Su Qin had arrived with dinner. As he stood up and walked toward the gate, he happened to step directly on the blood-eyed monster with a wet thud, instantly turning it into a pile of mush. Back in his own room, Chen Wenshan stared at the failure screen in total disbelief. He had finally evolved a decent species and was ready to conquer the world. How could he have been stepped to death the moment he hit land? Meanwhile, our protagonist opened the door to find Su Qin had brought another delicious meal. She peered into the yard and asked how he could be so happy farming all by himself. He simply replied that farming brought him peace, leaving her staring in shock. She felt a profound change in his aura, noting that he seemed far more elegant and refined than before. She even joked that he must be using some kind of cheat code. Though he had reverted to his original appearance, the transcendent aura gained from witnessing 3 mass extinctions was something he couldn't quite hide. He simply touched her forehead and asked if she was feeling ill. Having successfully deflected her curiosity, she changed the subject to his life in the courtyard. She asked if he was bored and offered to take him out shopping. He paused, surprised, and asked what had happened to the girlfriend she used to have. She explained they had broken up after he got sick and resigned. To her, it seemed he was in a tragic spiral, a terminal illness, no job, and a lost love. She lamented that he was stuck in the countryside waiting for the end, and then made a surprising offer. She would be his girlfriend until the very end. It was a childhood wish of hers, she claimed, and her experience as a volunteer meant she knew exactly how to care for a terminally ill patient. He offered to cook for her, walk with her, and talk with her, anything to make her final days a little brighter. He just wanted her to be happy. The mention of his final days left him momentarily speechless. He looked at her with a playful, knowing smile and asked if she was truly ready for all the duties of a girlfriend. Su Qin flinched and scrambled back a few steps, clutching her clothes. She insisted this was a pure romance, accusing him of trying to ruin her virtue while on his deathbed. She suggested they be surface-level lovers instead. He agreed quite bluntly, and she then mentioned that in a few days, their high school classmates would be meeting. She explained that since it was the summer break reunion, she wanted him to accompany her. With his good looks, her friends would surely be green with envy. She insisted he help her pick out clothes, noting that since he was idle and still had some money left, they should enjoy themselves while there was still time. One look into her eyes, and he knew he had fallen into a trap. The girl simply needed someone to fund her shopping and act as a trophy boyfriend. Gaining a surface-level girlfriend essentially meant gaining a little housekeeper. She might be impulsive, but she would provide carefully prepared meals every day. This meant he wouldn't have to eat out in the county anymore. After all, with his supposed stomach cancer, outside food was far too unhygienic. Returning to business, we see him studying the blood-eyed creature. Though he had stepped on one, the species still existed in the small sandbox, albeit near extinction. Since 2/3 of its body was a giant eyeball, it was destined to be weeded out by nature, unless he granted it the rights of a transcendent species. Left alone, they would surely vanish, but perhaps like the bug apes, they were merely weak in the early stages and could grow powerful later on. He decided to introduce this species into the Great Sandbox, carving out a specific swamp area within the vast world of the White Mother. He used stone and cattle manure to create a fertile, decaying mudland, which would soon begin to transform through the power of microorganisms. As fermentation produced biogas, the area became a sticky, bubbling mire, and he placed the blood-eyed creatures directly into this new habitat. With no competition here, even the weakest could multiply. Whether they could eventually become the first transcendent monsters was entirely up to them. Meanwhile, the game in the small sandbox had completely exploded in popularity after the first player, Chen Wenshan, posted a detailed review online. The core hook was the 100% realism. Players felt everything their evolved species felt, and death meant starting over from scratch. Wenshan even wrote that his ultimate goal was to evolve into a legendary dragon, so he could fly over the courtyard and find that apple-peeling giant. Specifically, he wanted to drop a gift on the giant's head. To be honest, the last species that dared to provoke our protagonist didn't fare very well. He silently made a mental note of this debt. Within a single day, the 100 slots for the small sandbox were completely filled. Online, thousands signed a petition demanding more beta slots, but our protagonist didn't care. He wasn't making any money from them, after all. He welcomed their suggestions, but had no intention of adopting them. He was too lazy to expand what was meant to be a simple side project. Unless something truly unexpected surprised him, the game would remain in beta forever as he shifted his focus back to the Great Sandbox. We return to the Great Sandbox, for this is the real work. Strictly speaking, the previous era only produced 3 transcendent entities, including Gilgamesh. For the next civilization, he wants to see a mature system of cultivation emerge, ideally, the evolution of a true wizard civilization. Previously, Gilgamesh had commissioned court dark wizards to research longevity potions, which served as the very first prototype for wizardry. He hopes for a great wizard to arise, one skilled in alchemy and medicine who might even create something capable of curing cancer. To build this complete transcendent system, the sandbox needs mysterious and dangerous species to serve as research materials for these future wizards. We look toward the swampy mire of the Great Sandbox. A day passes, and the blood-eyed creatures have multiplied significantly, even evolving unique individuals. With a slight adjustment of time, a century passes. Without natural enemies in this new environment, the blood-eyed creatures have bred like wildfire. But soon, overpopulation leads to internal competition and food shortages. They begin to prey upon one another, turning to cannibalism to survive. Gradually, a unique blood-eyed creature emerges, possessing a strange mental power. Any creature it gazes upon becomes charmed and walks toward it. The victim becomes a willing meal. This first-generation transcendent blood-eyed creature quickly rises to become the undisputed overlord of the swamp ecosystem. Unchecked, it breeds obsessively. The ordinary blood-eyed creatures are soon slaughtered in massive numbers by this superior, predatory lineage. Now, the entire swamp is filled with blood-eyed descendants possessing charm abilities. A transcendent species with chaotic mental power has finally arrived. Our protagonist feels a slight thrill. It took until the fourth epoch for the first truly transcendent species to be born. But then, he notices something else. In the Great Sandbox, another dramatic event is unfolding. A group of bug apes has actually set foot into that very same swampy mire. 2 centuries have passed since the Great Flood. The descendants of the Yanli tribe now wear animal skins and clothes, no longer needing thick fur. Their black body hair has gradually thinned, their sparse outer shells have vanished, and their frames have begun to stand tall and straight. Revealing pale skin, they have transitioned from hairy primates into a subhuman species with much more refined features. Their physiques now closely resemble strong, rugged humans. They once possessed a glorious city-state civilization, yet now they remain in simple farming tribes. Their former glory was built entirely on the foundation of the hero king, Gilgamesh. That great king was a force of nature himself. He single-handedly suppressed the world's giant beasts, placing the Yanli race at the top of the food chain. But without their hero king, they are vulnerable. Without metal tools, they had no way to advance into the Bronze or Iron Ages, relying instead on crude stone spears and clubs to fight giant beasts. The only relic of their civilization, the Holy Sword of Damocles, had long since sunk with Gilgamesh into the endless depths of the Great Flood. At this moment, Mugo, the daughter of the Babylon tribe's leader, sighed at how brilliant the Yanli era had once been, a true epic belonging to one man. That was the age of the great hero king, Gilgamesh. It is no wonder the people of that time felt compelled to honor him. They wrote epics to record his glory, yet Mugo felt that her own era had fallen into a slow, inevitable decline. She told herself that if the God-given sword of civilization hadn't been lost, they might have thrived even without the power of the blood of strength. Life wouldn't be this difficult, for civilization is the strength found within wisdom. Mugo, however, wanted more than just survival. She sought the path forward for their civilization, wondering how they were truly meant to live. Despite her inner turmoil, her expression remained calm. She was the bravest and wisest in the tribe. Though her raw strength was less than a man's, her killing techniques allowed her to defeat most warriors. She turned to the lean, strong men beside her and asked for a report on their exploration of this new region. A warrior replied that the area was a vast mire, likely formed by receding waters left behind after the Great Flood. The swamp was teeming with life and many delicious fruits. Little did they know, this fertile land was actually a byproduct of our protagonist's earlier work. As Mugo took a deep breath and gazed at the vast black quagmire, the vegetation appeared far more lush than anything they had seen before. She intended to mark this as the tribe's next gathering point, but suddenly, she sensed something was wrong. 2 of her people had vanished. The warriors looked at each other in confusion. Such a disappearance was unprecedented. Something was definitely not right. Giant beasts couldn't set foot in the swamp without sinking, and there were no tracks. Only small swamp creatures could be hiding here. Suspecting a stealthy ambush, Mugo decisively ordered her group of 20 to retreat. But at that exact moment, the mud began to shift. A disgusting, grayish-black tentacle suddenly emerged from the mire, surrounded by a mass of gray algae that looked like a ghostly image. At the center of this mass sat a single, terrifying. It was bloodshot and pulsing, staring back at them from the depths of the swamp. The 4 warriors stared into those massive eyes as if they had seen the most beautiful woman in the world, walking forward with a fanatical obsession that no one could restrain. Mugo instantly sensed the danger. Those sinister, giant eyeballs possessed the terrifying ability to charm their prey into approaching them voluntarily. She realized the 2 missing men had likely walked straight into their own deaths. In that moment, she made the cold, decisive choice to act. She abandoned those already under the spell and ordered the others to flee, but suddenly, she stopped in her tracks, her gaze burning with a new intensity. She marveled at what a strange creature this was. On the surface, they seemed even weaker and more fragile than the humans themselves. With their soft, limp tentacles and foolishly large eyes, they nonetheless possessed an incredible, inexplicable power. It was a power that could destroy beings far stronger than themselves. She couldn't help but wonder, weren't the humans just as small and weak? Why was it that only these monsters held such a unique gift? In Mugo's eyes, a nameless fire began to burn as a dangerous thought took root. A dark ambition awakened within her. She would seize this power for herself. She commanded her people to kill the creature before they made their escape. The tribe was shocked, but she had already turned back, raising her white stone spear high as a sliver of light fell from the sky. The light illuminated her cold, beautiful face, making her look like a goddess of war stepped straight out of an ancient myth. However, someone shouted a warning. More of these creatures were closing in from the depths of the black mire. Dozens of giant-eyed tentacle monsters were writhing through the muck, their viscous limbs crawling forward with a speed that was almost laughably slow. Yet their eerie power was terrifying to the extreme. Mugo knew that even if they were surrounded, she had to kill at least one, no matter the cost. Lifting her spear, she transformed into the tribe's most ferocious warrior and charged straight ahead, striking with a single, powerful thrust. Accompanied by a sharp, hoarse scream like a crying infant, the fragile eyeball exploded under the force of her impact. But in that moment of victory, she paused again, her eyes filled with a feverish heat as she studied the remains of this miraculous being. We see her fascination growing. These creatures were so physically weak, with nothing but soft tentacles and those absurdly large eyes. And yet, they held a power that defied logic, capable of bringing down the strongest predators. She asked herself again, were they not just as vulnerable? Why should these monsters be the only ones to possess such a gift? Within Mugo's gaze, a flicker of something revolutionary began to shine. A nameless fire burned within her as a dangerous thought took root in her heart. She would seize this power for herself, no matter the cost. She commanded them to kill the creature before they fled, and while the tribe stood frozen in shock, Mugo turned back and raised her white stone spear high. A sliver of light fell from the sky, illuminating her cold, beautiful face until she looked like a goddess of war stepped straight out of an ancient myth. She ordered them to help her kill it, intent on bringing the creature's corpse back to the tribe, but more of these beings were already closing in. Someone shouted a warning as they looked toward the depths of the black mire, where dozens more of those giant-eyed tentacle monsters were appearing. They were writhing through the muck, their viscous limbs crawling forward with a speed that was, to be perfectly honest, almost laughably slow. Yet their eerie power was terrifying to the extreme, and Mugo knew that even if they were surrounded, she had to kill at least one of them. Lifting her spear, she transformed into the tribe's most ferocious warrior and charged straight ahead, striking the creature with a single, powerful thrust. Accompanied by a sharp, hoarse scream like a crying infant, the fragile eyeball exploded instantly into a spray of disgusting, viscous fluid. As the slime splattered across her face, Mugo didn't flinch. She simply grabbed the creature's limp tentacles and began to retreat with her prize.